We'll go ahead and start with introductions, though. Amy, are you ready?
Yes. Okay. Hi, I'm Amy Lemke. I am the clinical social worker and clinic coordinator at the University of Iowa in their Huntington's Center of Excellence. And I'm happy to be here today and talk about crisis management with Caitlin.
And I'm Caitlin DeJarnett. I'm one of the social workers at our Center of Excellence at the University of Cincinnati. We're very lucky to have 2 social workers there, so I'm one of those. And we have a clicker. Fabulous. Okay. We have no affiliations, no disclosures, anything like that. We don't get paid for any of the things that we're going to talk about for that. All right. So a little bit about what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what a crisis is, the nature of a crisis, things that might come up in a crisis situation, definitions of a crisis, and the stages of Huntington's and how that kind of correlates with crises that you might encounter, and then give some toolbox tips, hopefully, to help you for when you may encounter a crisis.
A couple of things we wanted to go over, though, before we get started is just a reminder that this session is being live streamed. And so we want to make sure that everyone's aware of that, not in an effort to squelch any type of conversation we would love to hear from everyone in the room, but we just want you aware so that you're not surprised by that. And also, like, these can be, crises happen and it's tension. There's like oftentimes 2 sides to this story. And so we've got 2 parties. We have individuals that are living with this disease that's changing my personality and changing what I can do. And I have a lot of feelings about that. And then there's a partner here who's like, I'm also juggling more responsibilities and things are changing for me. So it's rife. The situation is rife for some tension and some conflict, and we want to make sure that we respect both sides of that story. And so it takes a team to do this. And so we want to make sure that we acknowledge that we see that there is change and there is loss and there is grief and there is stress and there is also joy and there is love on both sides of this equation. And so we want to make sure that we acknowledge that. Okay, so when we were asked to start crisis management, one of the things I thought about for crisis is so we typically think of crisis as this sudden, unexpected thing that happens, and it disrupts our sense of normalcy. And so, disclosure about me, I'm not such a fan of normal. It makes me think of that meme where there's a child that says, "Hey mom, what's normal?" And she says, "It's just a setting on the dryer." And so I think of it like that. It's like, what's normal for me in our house, you might find completely bizarre. And so crisis disrupts normal. And in the context of living and sharing a home and supporting someone who's experiencing neurological changes, normal becomes different and it shifts. And so I was trying to think about, how do we make crises, we normalize crises? Is that possible to normalize crises? And I found this framework. How many of you are from Minnesota? Any Minnesotans? So Dr. Martha Nance, epic researcher and clinician in this field, who's out of Minnesota, she came up with this framework and she developed it for clinicians to conceptualize all the dimensions of a life for a person living with Huntington's disease and their families, and for providers to recognize all the different things that could come into play. And she calls it the HD molecule. And as you look in the middle, it has the PhD, that stands for person with HD. And then it has around them their support people, their family, a spouse at risk, extended families. And one of the things that she concludes in here as an element of a framework for clinicians to be mindful of is managing crises. And so I liked this because it helped us to kind of normalize that this might pop up. And so when we were working together, one of the things we thought about was, how can we somewhat normalize crises, but how can we prepare people for them? But more importantly, as Dr. Nance in her wisdom pointed out, how can we prepare for the future? So we took an approach of 2-prong. One was how to help plan for what might pop up so that in our planning, we mitigate or we dissipate the intensity of a potential crisis. Now, are we perfect at all this? No. Do curveballs come our way? Absolutely. And so, but taking just some beginning steps at what might not have crossed your minds as individuals living with this disease or caring for someone with this disease, these might be some steps to consider. So I liked this because it helped us kind of conceptualize and normalize all the different aspects. And I need to watch what I'm doing, don't I, for time? Okay. Okay. So I'm like, watch my time. Before we start, though, one of the things it's really difficult to manage. Like, I'm really concerned about this. I'll field phone calls like, I'm really, really concerned. Like, she's living in squalor. Like, it's a mess. And so how do you tease out what's a crisis and what's something that I'm really concerned about and what's an individual's right to make their own choices and be autonomous? But then when do we start to like throw up the white flag and say, hey, we really need some help here? And it's kind of really three things, I think. And one is if somebody's safety is at risk, like eminently at risk, either yours or the person with HD, we could be dealing more with a crisis versus an individual's rights. The other one is if there's something going on that really leads you to believe that they're in touch with reality, it's just not there, that there's some type of neurological change that's creating maybe some psychiatric symptoms like delusions or hallucinations that therefore could put someone really at risk, then we're leaning more towards a crisis. And the third thing is looking at, is there something going on that like eminently could create a really large health risk, like hasn't eaten or slept for days, then we're shifting into something else. Oh goodness. Are you dizzy yet? So I like to, I'm not a linguist, but I like to, like, when words come up, and typically words that we use a lot, I like to Google them and be like, what do we mean? What do we mean when we say crisis? Like, what does that mean? And so Google, like, advanced degrees by Google, Google comes up with two main definitions, and one is a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. And so when there's difficult or important decisions, a strategy to use is to plan. How can I plan for this? How can I plan for this potential or potentially imminent upcoming decision? And a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. And those are some of the situations like I referred to previously about what is a crisis. And those are more strategy. And so Caitlin's going to cover the strategy part, and I'm going to cover the planning part. And so I won't go over each one of these for time, but important decisions. So then I'm like, what is important? Like, how do you define important? And important is something of pronounced significance. And when you think about something about pronounced significance, I think about things like, I don't know about you, but my paycheck, my safety, my children's safety when they're in the car with someone who's driving. I think about things like that these are things that, because of the nature of this disease, changes in these dimensions are going to occur. And so what are some of these important decisions? And what they are is oftentimes determined by the stage that we're in this disease. This disease has stages, and the care that we need is predicted by the stage that we're in. And how do we know what that is, which we'll get to next? And yet, we're talking about a neurological disease. And so that will be highly variable. What I need in stage one may be very, very different than if Caitlin were in stage one. And so that's highly variable based upon the stage. It's that saying, I'm sure you've all heard it, if you know one person with HD, you know one person with HD. It's our brains. It's the organ that makes us the most unique. And so it's going to be highly variable. So that's my disclaimer. So how do you put stage? And so to wrap our brains around this, I found there are 3 stages, and this was put together by a group out of the University of Virginia, I believe. And they developed these stages more as a model to help clinicians figure out what issues are important in working with individuals with Huntington's disease, so that clinicians would know, like, these are the functional changes in this stage, and these are some of the goals. And so for the early stage is more around, there's some clinical, you may have just received a clinical diagnosis, there may be some mild motor changes, and so some of the functional changes are in coordination. Incoordination may make work difficult. Incoordination may make driving difficult. There you may start to see some mild cognitive changes, but for the most part, independent in taking care of myself in my day-to-day life. And so the goals and priorities are the families and the patient and their support systems. Those are some of the goals and priorities in this early stage, which is planning ahead. Looking ahead and seeing what we need in these areas: household, financial management, modifications at work. So, household and financial management. One of the calls, I get calls, and it will be like, you know what? My husband's always managed the bills. I've never had to pay any attention to that. But I just got an email that says we've been behind. He hasn't paid this bill for 3 months. What am I going to do? How are we going to recover from this? Or, oh my gosh, she stops at work every day and she's spending tons of money, and we can't, there's so much impulsive spending and I'm not able to pay our other bills. Or even, and this is a risk for all of us, they're calling her and they're scammers and we've been scammed and they've taken our identity, and what are we going to do? And so these are some strategies that are available out there to plan ahead and reflect on, how do we do these things in our own family? And I won't go over every single one, but I wanted to talk about a couple of them. One is, there are some online budgeting tools. One's called Greenlight. It's an app, and you load money into the app, and then, so there's still autonomy, you can still spend money, but you can also limit it. It's not going to work at the casino. It's not going to work at TJ Maxx, Amy, so you're done. So it limits spending in those areas. There's also a way, if you contact the 3 credit bureaus, you could put a freeze on credit under an individual's name so that no additional lines of credit could be taken out. And then if there is an attempt, that you're notified, which would also help in the situation of a scam. Other protections for a scam would be placing someone's telephone number on a do not call list. So beginning steps, proactive steps that could circumvent or help reduce your risk for a crisis in this area. While we're talking money, early stages, hopefully we're still all, individuals have been working. They're working, and there's always this tension of do I tell my employer? How much do I tell my employer? What do I tell my employer? Which will be addressed tomorrow in a different session. But it's stopping and thinking about what is occurring in my life that's really difficult. What is most difficult about my day right now? And this would be a continuous thing. So my poor attempt at graphics as a circular motion, but this will be a continuous thing. What is most difficult? Where do my symptoms seem to be creating stress and anxiety and challenges for me? How are they getting in the way of my day-to-day life? Both at home and at work. Again, graphic failure. So accommodations at work. Keeping money coming in. I don't know about you, but I need money coming in. I can't go very long without it. And so thinking about, reflecting on, losing a job changes the financial security of your home and places you at risk for a crisis. So, but you could ask for some job accommodations. And so that's always kind of a tricky part. And what the main thing I want you to take away from this slide is one thing, and that's that hyperlink there. So I hope that you have a way to get a hold of that. Or you can Google the Job Accommodation Network, Huntington's disease. And the Job Accommodation Network has a specific web page for Huntington's disease, working with Huntington's disease, and accommodations that you could request. And they have a really cool table, and it breaks it down by, this is my job skill and this is my limitation. And so like, if this is my job skill, and my job skill is I need to communicate with other individuals, but I'm really having a hard time with words, like it's taking me longer, it's slow. If that's your job skill, you could click on it and it'll give you a drop-down menu of a number of accommodations and things that may help. Some of it's technology, some of it's strategy. So let's talk about limitations or challenges. I don't like the word limitation. Limitation or challenges. Let's say processing speed. Processing speed for me is really slow. You would click on that and it would give you things that you could talk to work about. You can also look for letters for how to request a job accommodation through that, or Google that. So that, I wanted to get that out because that may help this planning piece of preventing a financial crisis. And I want people aware of what's out there to provide support. Healthcare, what do I got? Healthcare, so preventing a healthcare crisis. Before I started in Huntington's disease, I worked for a very long time in a health system, and I worked in nephrology, home care, hospice, palliative care, inpatient rehab, emergency department, and people coming in crisis. And what happens in crisis is that the base part, the fight or flight part of our brain, is like on fire and active, and it knocks the front part of our brain, our ability to reason and weigh out choices and make decisions, it knocks it offline. And so that's the value of planning, and that's particularly relevant and pertinent in an emergency medical situation. And so even though you're not in a medical crisis right now, it's a great time to think about, if I were, who do I want, as I so eloquently say, driving my bus? Who do I want as my agent? Who do I want my doctors to talk to? And the biggest piece about that is, who do you think would make the decision that you want, not what they want? And those are very distinct things. I've watched individuals say, oh, it's my oldest daughter, and I'm gonna let my oldest daughter. But the oldest daughter is like, oh, do absolutely everything because I can't stand the thought of living without my dad. And the dad has said, I don't want any of these very aggressive things. And so we're stuck because that individual is going to drive the bus. And so it's very important that they make the decision that you would want. And sometimes that's tough on a spouse too. Like, I don't know. I keep telling my best friend, like, you're it. If I'm in a medical emergency, you're it, because she could lower the boom and make a tough decision under stress. And so it's really important to think about those things. What happens if you don't have one? If you don't have one, every state has an order of surrogacy, an order of priority, and this is the order of priority. So if you don't have a spouse, it'll go to adult children. Notice it says children. So it varies by state again, but it may be that it is a consensus of all adult children. And so challenge if not all your adult children get along. That could create another crisis in and of itself. So it's important to think about, do I need this? And I share this as information to think about, like, where would be my order of priority and what would happen then? How do we know what people want? Planning ahead so I can avoid a medical emergency. You can Google Adriana Labs. It was founded by Atul Gawande. Anybody familiar with Atul Gawande? He wrote the book Being Mortal. So he has this nonprofit group, and they have fabulous resources. If you Google What Matters to Me, it's a workbook that you could do, and it's something that would change. So this is a process. It's not an event, but it has interesting questions to really think about. I wouldn't recommend sitting down and doing it in one shot. I would recommend doing it in stages, but it has questions like, times when I'm the most happy are this. Things that are the most tough for me to deal with are this. My favorite question is, this ability is so important to me that I cannot imagine living without it. And how do you use that information? That information is really relevant to your families because they could use it when they're talking with doctors and saying, okay, so you're saying that this is our choice. What's the likelihood if we do this, that these things will either be avoided or will be protected? And so helps you think about the lens of the options based upon what's important to the individual. So this is it's called the Conversation Project also as well. So if you Google it, it's the best that I've seen out there. So middle stage. In the middle stage, the functional changes that are starting to occur are that we may start to see changes in, like, work has gotten really hard. I go to work and it takes so much of my mental energy that I come home and I'm exhausted. And then I'm sleeping all night and I'm missing my life with my family. And you may also see, like, it's getting more and more difficult for me to do things around the house. I'm not able to help my spouse in the kitchen anymore. I'm at risk for harming myself with a sharp thing, or I'm leaving the stove on. So you're starting to see some changes in functional abilities. And so some of the goals and priorities are getting support, emotional support, focusing on quality of life. And then in the medical care goals, one of the things that I'll point out soon is using PT-OT speech. And I like to use PT-OT speech in creative ways. They're beyond, like, OT and speech, beyond what we normally conceptualize them. There's some ways to use them to help in this stage. But one of the big things is retiring from driving. And I like the term retiring from driving versus stopping driving. It feels like a progression, which the retirement from driving is more of, it's a process and it's a conversation that will happen over and over. And it may be something that we say, what are you noticing? How are you noticing when you get to a four-way stop? I don't know about you, but where I moved to the Iowa City area a few years ago, and where I came from, it was a four-way stop. It wasn't this crazy roundabout thing, and that roundabout thing about gives me a heart attack every freaking time. And so, like, talking about what are you noticing? Is that different? My sister says, when you're in the middle, you're king. I'm like, okay, all right. So focus on this as a transition and not as, what the heck were you thinking back there? Like, I noticed you're scaring the crap out of me. And anticipate that one of the things that gives us the most autonomy is our ability to get in the car and go. Like, that's really hard thing to retire from. So some things, planning ahead, proactive things to do. If you're starting to notice changes, plan all trips in advance and use a GPS. Secure your cell phone. Okay, we're going to get in a habit of that. We secure our cell phone on this thing so that we're not chasing it around when it slides off the seat. Or putting the cell phone in do not disturb when driving. What to do? What to do when I won't stop? Like, I don't want to stop. And this is that recognizing that you can Google. This is a stage is a change model. That change is a process. It's not an event. And so if you Googled this and you're like, we've had this conversation, but they're still refusing to drive, what do I do? You could find, like, questions to ask, such as, how will you know when it's time to reduce your driving or change your driving habits? That's relevant. Skilled therapy evaluations. I put this in here in this. So we noticed that one of the changes was, I may not be working. And I hear this. I've stopped working. Let's say I'm an individual with HD and I've stopped working, and so I'm at home, but I'm noticing that I have changes in my brain and I'm having more apathy, and that the changes in my brain, my ability to initiate and motivate myself have shifted, and I'm not taking initiative and I'm not motivated. And my spouse is out working and my spouse comes home and I've sat on the couch all day and my spouse is mad. Like, you've sat on the couch all day, and so what are you doing? And I'm like, I know that you're pissed at me, but I don't know what to do. I know I should be, but I'm not. This is an excellent place to start to use skilled therapies, particularly occupational therapy or speech therapy. You can use them for cognitive changes, and they can help you come up with schedules and identifying. They do these interest surveys, and they help you plan a day. And they come up with, like, hey, I may be the spouse and say, he used to like to call our kids, and now he doesn't call anybody. I just come home, and there's nothing done. There's nothing. They can come up with telephone scripts of like, you can call your loved one and say this and talk about this and talk about this. So it's strategies to help you stay engaged with your life around you and your relationships. So creatively using these skilled therapies is important. You can also use occupational therapy to do a driving evaluation, although they're oftentimes not covered by insurance and they cost about $400 out of pocket where I'm at. Palliative care. So healthcare. Palliative care is that bridge between I'm living life without a serious illness, I'm living with a serious illness, and I'm having more and more medical decisions coming my way, more and more symptoms that are curtailing my quality of life, curtailing what I can do. But I'm not ready for I'm not hospice. I don't have a 6-month prognosis, but I do have this serious illness that is creating some hiccups for us on a regular basis and influencing my sense of quality of life. Palliative care is a medical service, a specialized medical service that is available. Now, this is not as organized as hospice. It's highly, highly variable. In some places in the state of Iowa, we have outpatient clinics for palliative care, so you would have to go to them, and they would help you kind of negotiate, like, speech is telling us this, neurology is telling us this, psychiatry is telling us this, we don't know what to do. They help you sort through those decisions and figure those things out. Sometimes it's at an outpatient clinic. Sometimes they have in-home services. One area of my state has a great in-home service, and I was using them a whole lot. And then last month I found out that the demand was so high they switched to only cancer patients. But if you're feeling like you have more symptoms impacting the quality of your life and you want to help prevent a medical emergency and anticipate what's coming and plan, asking your COE or your social worker about what palliative care options are available are there. A POST is is anybody familiar with a POST? Okay. A POST stands for Physician's Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. So how is this relevant? Let's say I'm home all day by myself. I'm noticing that I'm stumbling more, I'm falling, we've had to call the ambulance. And so that's where this comes into play. And so a POST is a medical order. So it's not a legal document. It's a medical order from your doctor. And where does it become relevant? It's something that you would go over with your doctor would sign it. And it says things like, I never want a feeding tube. I might want a feeding tube for a short period of time. I want a feeding tube. Also says, I don't want any type of intubation, or I might do intubation for a short period of time, or of course I want intubation. And more importantly, if my heart stops beating and I stop breathing and I get away from you, don't let me do CPR, or let me. If everything you're doing doesn't stop that train and I get away from you, then I don't want CPR. And so where does this come into play? You call the ambulance, the rig comes to your house, it's taking you to the medical center, and in between your home and that medical center, your heart stops. Without that, if you don't want CPR, then you want a POST on board with you so that they'll follow that order. So it's just kind of planning ahead for a medical emergency to protect your wishes in that area. By how much? So, and then this is what the functional changes of late stages HD that I included so that we weren't remiss. But I'm going to transition now for those situations where we've done all the planning, we've taken some proactive steps, but sometimes crises occur. And so I'm going to let Caitlin talk about that.
Okay. So now I want to talk about when we're in a crisis, when we're experiencing a crisis. And the biggest part, with the second part of our Google definition, is that intense difficulty, trouble, danger. The CDC has another definition. Sorry, the word was escaping me. Another definition, when there's acute emotional upset and it's manifested by an inability to cope. And I think a lot of times when we are experiencing a crisis with a person with HD, that's kind of what's happening. We are having an event that occurs that leads to emotional crisis in the family, with the person. And so how do we prepare for that? How do we plan for that? And I have physical, mental, and safety crises lifted up here. We're not going to talk about physical crises because I feel like it's more self-explanatory. I do have it up here. We're going to bypass it, skip right by. So mental health disorder, when we're thinking of mental health, we want to look at it in the specifics of what does this qualify as? Is this a mental health crisis, or is this just something that might be a little concerning but hasn't reached the point of a crisis? So we want to make sure that, if something mental health is occurring with a person with HD, it needs to be clinically significant to be a crisis. It needs to be impairing their functioning. It needs to be causing distress to you or to the person with HD. And a lot of times this can be tricky with what we were talking about earlier with what is a choice versus what is a crisis. And sometimes people make socially deviant choices, or choices that are not necessarily what we would choose, perhaps, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a mental health crisis. And there's a fine line with that. And I would encourage you to talk with your local social worker, your COE social worker, and they'll kind of help you feel that out with, okay, we may be seeing some symptoms, but we're not quite at a crisis stage yet, or we're definitely at a crisis. Let's take some action. So when we look at a crisis, there's 4 parts. The first part is the event that happens. This crisis occurred, and maybe it's, the person with Huntington's locked themselves in a room and barricaded the door and won't come out, and they are threatening to harm themselves. Maybe that's the crisis. The second part is how we think about or how we perceive a crisis. The third part is our emotional response to that crisis. How are we feeling? How is the person with Huntington's feeling? And the last part is the dysfunction or the outcome or result, right? A lot of times when we think about a crisis, we think about here's the event that happens and here's the outcome. The middle part is the most important part of how we perceive that event and how we emotionally respond to that event. And as families of people with Huntington's, you have the ability to really shape how that looks for the person with Huntington's and for your family. So we'll come back to that a couple of times, but I wanted to have the visual for you guys to see. So a mental health crisis, how are we going to identify one? And I have a list up here. It's not an exhaustive list, but it can range anywhere from, we're looking at severe depression, suicidal thoughts, to maybe more of a psychosis situation. And these are obviously things we hope we never encounter. But what we know about Huntington's disease is it's erratic. We don't always know what's going to happen. And so being prepared and knowing what to look for is important. Is that person having hallucinations? Is that person having thoughts that don't make any kind of logical sense? Are they giving all of their prized possessions away? Are they not eating? These are all kinds of things that we want to look for with a person with Huntington's that may be indicating we're on the verge of a mental health crisis, or maybe we're already there, depending on the severity of those symptoms and things that are happening. So physical safety crisis, I put this one here because I think a lot of times when we're having a physical safety crisis, it's co-occurring with a mental health crisis in Huntington's. So when we, having a mental health crisis is one thing. Maybe there's delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, but it can become a physical health or a physical crisis very quickly when it interrupts the safety of people in the home, the safety of the person with Huntington's, when there's weapons involved. All of these things create not only a mental health crisis, but now there's physical safety concern. And so being aware, as we're looking at the progression of things that can happen, we want to make sure that we're prepared for, we hope this doesn't happen with a mental health crisis, but it can very easily turn to a physical health crisis. So what are we going to take? What steps are we going to take when a safety crisis occurs? Take a breath, first of all, right? We as caregivers, as family members, as people who support someone with Parkinson's, really, again, have that ability when you're looking at those two center points of a crisis, the perception of what's happening and the emotional response is how we can help shape what the crisis looks like for the person with Huntington's and for our families. So take a breath. We're going to plan for it. We're going to assess for safety. Who is in the home? Who is at risk? Are there kids in the home? Is there animals in the home that might be at risk? Is the person with Huntington's at risk? Are they a threat to themselves? Assessing what that looks like, and then planning for, okay, how are we going to create safety here? We have a crisis. We have something that's going on. We need to create safety, and maybe that's removing like physical distance, creating physical distance from the person that's having a mental health crisis. Maybe it's leaving the house. Maybe it's, hey kids, come over here, let's go to the neighbors. There's a lot of planning and forethought that is involved in that. So we want to make sure, I know we're talking about in the midst of a crisis, but the best way to get through a crisis is to plan beforehand. And then we're going to call the helpers, and we'll talk a little bit about what that help team looks like, who's on your team, but we need to get them involved if there's a crisis, especially a safety crisis, but also a mental health crisis. And that can be really scary and really challenging for families, I think, because no one ever wants to make that call, right? No one ever wants to be like, hello, my loved one is experiencing something, I don't feel safe, right? That's a scary thing. But we want to make sure we get those people involved to get that person the help that they need and to make sure everyone there is safe. And then we're going to relay information, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I'm going to very briefly go over this and give the caveat that HD Reach, if you've never been to their website, has an amazing crisis planning section. If you go to their website and then go over to caregivers, they have a crisis planning worksheets that you can build yourself based on your family specifically. You can fill in the numbers for mobile crisis, for your local law enforcement, all the different people and helpers that might be involved. So I would definitely encourage you to go to their website. But when you're calling an emergency responder, you want to make sure that you're giving them details, but not 6 months of details, right? Be specific, be time-oriented, and be direct with what's happening. So maybe it's, hi, my name is Caitlin. I am with a person with Huntington's disease. They have a weapon. They're unable to be calmed down, and I need help now, right? Specifics, not 9 months of specifics, but going into enough detail to say, here's what's going on. And then when those first responders get there, giving more detail and talking through, for maybe 2 weeks, they've been really anxious. They were talking about seeing people in the corner and going through more of those details to help them understand how best to help. All right, so, time, we're good. Okay, safety action plan. As we're kind of looking at those first symptoms and signs of behavioral concerns, we can start to make a plan, right? Hide the weapons, especially if someone is displaying any kind of thoughts to harm themselves, thoughts to harm others, acting kind of bizarrely. You want to hide the weapons, or if you have a gun safe, lock up those weapons. I've had people drive all of their knives and all of their guns to a neighbor's house or to their father-in-law's house. But creating that safe space and that safety beforehand is crucial so that if something happens down the road, there's less what we would consider lethal means, right? There's less things that would be harmful and cause serious damage to anyone or anything. Lock medications, that's an important one too, especially if there's any kind of suicidal thoughts or concerns. Planning with your friends and neighbors. You may not be home when this person has a mental health crisis, and it's important for other people who might be around to know what to do. So giving them instructions of, hey, if you see anything strange or bizarre, let me know, give me a call. And obviously, if there's something that's more immediate and can't wait till I get home, call the police and then call me and let me know. Emergency items, I have a slide on that. I'm going to probably bypass it. And HD Reach, again, has an amazing listing of what you could put in an emergency go bag if you needed to have that. It ranges from what to plan for kids to what to plan for the person with Huntington's if they did have a hospital stay, money, all those different things. So we will bypass that one. Sometimes you do need to plan for a quick exit, though, especially if there's erratic, bizarre behavior. If that person is not thinking logically, then they're not acting logically. And so it's important for the safety of everyone who's around them to know, okay, how are we going to get out of the house if we need to? We hope that doesn't happen, but if we need to, how's that going to happen? Where are we going to go? Where are the kids going to go? And making a plan for that. Things can change very quickly with a mental health crisis, and you want to be prepared to know what's going to happen, where are we going to go. And again, HD Reach has amazing listings on that. I'm just going to keep plugging them because they're fabulous. I'm going to skip my go bag. I'm going to skip that one too. So team, we want to create a team of helpers. Who's going to be on our team? It's important that, again, when we have that crisis situation, when something is occurring that can create a safety concern, we need to call in the big guns, call in the team, make sure we have a team set up beforehand. That's going to create, again, that best outcome process. So you have emergency people on your team, and you're going to have non-emergency people on your team. And my suggestion is to reach out to both sides of that team and give them information on the person with Huntington's, especially if you live in an area where maybe you don't have a community social worker through HDSA, or you don't have a COE social worker, a Center of Excellence social worker who can kind of help network. It's important that you make those connections so that when the police come to your house, they aren't instantaneously putting the person on the ground and handcuffing them, right? That they understand there's a neurological condition here. There's something that's going on mentally, psychologically, physically, and we need to get that addressed and can help take appropriate steps and action for that. So your emergency team is going to consist of a lot of different people, and they're going to vary based on region. So I tried to be pretty general, but it's important to look up for your specific region who these people would be. So community-based mental health stabilization teams, I put APS on here. They are not always the most helpful just because of the age range that they typically require someone to be in. They usually will not go out or accept any kind of calls for people under the age of 65. In some states and some counties, that's different. So check with your local office, maybe give them a call and let them know what's going on. But I know in my area, it's that 65 marker. So mobile crisis, they're going to be your boots on the ground mental health stabilization team that will come out to your home to assess and evaluate the person having a mental health crisis. So they're going to be really helpful. Law enforcement, again, making that connection with your local law enforcement, letting them know what's going on and planning that way. And then a psychiatrist, which if the person is taken to a mental health facility, it would be whoever is on call, the attending. So it's hard to plan for that. If you live in a smaller area and there's like one psychiatrist, then that's better. But most of us, that might not be the case. So your non-emergency team, case managers, mental health therapists, neurologists, if they're involved in palliative care, HDSA social workers, COE social workers, a regular psychiatrist if they see one in an outpatient setting. All of these people are going to help make up your team and need to be educated and informed about what's going on so that they can know and help you plan and work through that. Okay, and I'm going to skip this one too because we talked about educating, but again, HD Reach has great resources to give to your local law enforcement, to give to your EMS, to give to all of these people so that they have a good reference of what even is HD, what are we dealing with? So I would encourage you guys to look at their website for that. Okay, persistence. This is a toughie. If anybody's ever worked with mental health in any realm, if you have needed it for a person with Huntington's, if you have used it yourself, if you've witnessed a family member or a friend interact with mental health services, you know that it's broken, right? Our mental health system is not perfect. It has a lot of flaws. And so sometimes the best thing that we can do in a crisis is be persistent. We may not get the interventions that we need the first time we have a crisis. Keep calling. We may not get the mobile crisis may come out and they may be like, they're fine. It's fine. Everything is fine. And you're like, no, it's not fine. Everything is not fine. But be persistent. When the next thing happens, call again. With a psychiatrist, even in an outpatient setting, the person with Huntington's may be saying, everything's great, no problem. And you're over here like, oh my gosh, there's so many problems. Be persistent with them too. Talk through what are the options. A lot of psychiatric medication as well requires that you take it for 4 to 6 weeks before you see any kind of significant change. So being consistent with that. After that time, if it's not working, talking to the psychiatrist, obviously if there's any kind of crazy side effects, talk to them before 4 to 6 weeks. But just understanding medications, not every medication works for every person, and it does take a while to kick in. Okay, this is my last little bit, I promise. We're going to go through a little toolbox, some helpful things for you guys as family members, caregivers. Documentation is super important when you're experiencing mental health crises. Obviously, don't stop in the middle of the crisis and take notes while the person is having a mental health emergency. But recording information is incredibly helpful to help your team know what to do next. So if you've been noticing some things before the actual crisis event, make sure that you're documenting them. Sometimes it's helpful to have a set time every week to document, okay, what's happened this week? What was going on this week that we need to address? And then be detailed about it in your documentation. Who, what, when, where, why, any other details under the sun. One of the most important things to document is, was there a precipitating event? Was there something that happened before this crisis that we can kind of note and look at and say, maybe this was a trigger. Maybe there was something else that was going on with the family system, but looking at that as, okay, the event happened, but usually an event is not that isolated 10 minutes. It's the 3 hours before and the 4 hours after, right? Okay. This is one of my favorite life hacks just as a human being. I used to work in the foster care world, and we used this a lot with that, but I think it is the most transcendent and wonderful information for all situations, so I like to share it whenever I can. But I want you to take a minute with me and think through a bouncy ball. Think about a bouncy ball. I usually bring one, but I switched backpacks, so I apologize for the lack of visual. But think about a bouncy ball. If I had a bouncy ball and I threw it at that wall, what would happen? It would bounce all over, right? It might bounce back this way and go that way and go everywhere. And that can be pretty disruptive, right? But if I had a container, like a Tupperware container, or even like a tote, right? If you put that bouncy ball in there and you shake up that Tupperware container, where's the ball going to go? It stays inside, right? And this is not, it's not a perfect plan, because when someone's experiencing a mental health crisis, you can't control what they're feeling, what they're thinking. They're in crisis mode. Like Amy was saying, the back of their brain, that fight or flight, is on fire, and they're not thinking clearly. But what we can do as family members, as caregivers, as people who care for someone with Huntington's, is look at being that emotional container. We are that external force that can help contain that emotion, right? When that person is experiencing a mental health crisis, our perception and our emotional response makes a huge difference in the outcome. Keeping your cool, talking to the person like a person, right? Creating safety, letting them voice their concerns, but also being calm and firm in your response. So I think a lot of times with this, if someone is, sorry, I forgot to breathe for a second. If someone is like the example I used before, if they're barricaded in a room, they have everything up against the door, they're paranoid, they're worried that someone is, gonna harm them. They may be very resistant to having any of these helpers and emergency responders come and help. And they may be screaming and saying, no, I don't want that. And our response as that emotional container is to say, I know it's scary. I know it's hard. I know you don't want to do this. It's scary for me. It's hard for me. But we have to. We're going to do it because I care about you and because I love you. And that's that calm and firm response that creates that emotional container for the situation. Okay, and de-escalation is a big part of being that emotional container. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but it is a really good thought process to think through, how do we become that emotional container? How do we be the calm in the storm of a crisis situation for our family and for the person with Huntington's? So breathing, one of the things I forgot to do 3 seconds ago, but that's important. How you contain and maintain your calm can transform the situation for everyone involved. One of the really cool things about our brains and our bodies is that we have like a symbiotic response to breathing. So if you have a partner and you are laying in bed with them, or if you have a child, like a screaming 2-year-old, right? Or you're trying to get your 2-year-old to nap. One of the really cool things is if you slow your breathing, the body's symbiotic response for that other person is to also slow their breathing. It's very cool. It's one of the mirror neuron kind of things, I think. But our calm is then contagious to everyone else around. If you have kids that are witnessing this crisis, this is crucial for them to make sure that you're maintaining that calm so that they can maintain that calm and hopefully spread that throughout whoever's involved with the crisis. Let's see. Remembering the goal is a big one on here. There will be a time after this crisis. So the way that we emotionally respond to the crisis is important for the long-term harmony of the family, right? So if we lose our cool, that can create issues down the road for maybe the kids are witnessing that and they're saying, oh, every time this happens, mom's going to be having a mental health crisis and dad's going to be, screaming about how we won't get in the car and it's going to be really stressful and really scary. But maintaining that control over ourselves can help mitigate that for the long term and create that felt safety, not only for the person, but for everyone in the family. And then the last one I'll talk about in here is creating choice. This is one of my favorite life hacks as well. We, as individual humans in the world, have a lot of choices, right? We choose what to wear. We choose what to eat. We choose where to go, what to do. A person with Huntington's disease loses a lot of their life choices. And that not only impacts, the independence that they experience, but it also impacts how they feel about themselves. When you don't have a lot of choice, you feel that in your body, you feel that in your brain. And so creating choice where we can is really helpful, not only to prevent a crisis, but also in the middle of a crisis. Do you want me to ride with you in the ambulance, or do you want me to drive behind the ambulance? Do you want me to sit here in silence with you, or do you want me to hold your hand? Do you want a drink? Sometimes adding water is the best. Add water. When life happens, add water. But do you want a drink of water? Do you want a snack? Creating those choices can help calm our brain and give us a sense of control over a situation where we don't have a lot of control. And that can be the same with the person with Huntington's, kids. If the kids are experiencing this, hey, do you want to go watch a movie at the neighbor's, or do you want me to call grandma to pick you up? Whatever the choices can be, create them where there isn't any, and that can help. Okay, I have 1 minute. I'm so sorry. What happens after? Again, we talked about this. It's not just the event. It's what happens after. And there's a lot of emotions to process from that for not only you as caregivers and families and the person with Huntington's, but anyone's involved. And so make sure that you have those conversations. It can be one of those taboo things in families to talk about after something happens like this. And I think socially and societally, it's like, we don't talk about that. You know, something happened last week, but we don't talk about it. But it's important to talk about it because that's what creates that long-term harmony, and you can work through all of these different situations and scenarios for the future. And inform your team. Make sure that your team of helpers knows what has happened. If you've documented, give them that documentation, follow up, let them know so that you guys can help plan for the future. Maybe there's a medication change, maybe there's a different team member we can involve, but follow up with them and make sure that they know. So I think that's the end. But if you guys have any questions, I know it's 3:30, so if you have to go, that's fine. We have some time. Okay, great. Anybody have questions, thoughts, concerns? No? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's very normal. One of the things that, I have always understood about lying is that it serves a purpose, right? Anytime someone lies, it's serving a purpose. It's fixing a felt need, right? So that need, finding that underlying need is important to then determine, okay, well, what can we do to help with that? So it sounds like it could be he feels like he's lost his independence. There's not a lot of things that he can control potentially. And so again, that's my little trick of creating choice can sometimes help with that, of where in his life is there other choices that he can make that feel and create that sense of independence that can maybe help with, okay, maybe I don't need to just get in the car and drive because I have other choices that can create independence for me. That's not like a fix all, but lying always serves a purpose, and finding that purpose is important. It is. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious, is it the driving concern? Is it
just that he might be somewhere and not be able to get home? He had a flash one time and drove home like
With the
35
flash.
miles, so ruined the tire and frame and
Yeah.
the whole shebang. And he lied that he didn't do that, but she knew he did because the bill was on the car.
Yeah.
So, he's just the spending things, and that was all interesting because he's done that too. I sold the lawnmower and then now I bought a brand new one and it's not complicated. It buys $600 worth of molding because it's going to wear out and it's going to change it. Well, you don't need to change it for 1 year.
Yeah.
It's all money.
It is. Yeah.
It's one of those tricky situations where you think the technology is going to help me because I know where he's at, but it's also now I'm prisoner to the anxiety that I know where he's at. Yeah, and so how do we where do you start with like exercise? When you, I was like, it sounds like control. Like I want to be autonomous, but how can I do this when my insight is putting us in these other situations that could end up being crises?
Maybe he just doesn't think of it. Maybe he just wants individuals to go with it. Maybe he needed a sign that says, have you texted to tell me where you're going?
Yeah.
Because I care.
Yes.
Something like that. But we just talked about that before I came here, so I don't just try it.
Yeah, I think it's, as Caitlin, and it's like, what am I emotionally looking for, which is control, in the context of I may have changes in my insight, and I'm not aware of it, but other people are. And so how can we, like, I'm okay if you go here. Like, I wonder, could there be strategies of, it's not that I want to control everything, although I might be guilty of that. How could we go here? Could we buy these things and then other things? It's not going to work. Just to start to try to put some bumper pads on that. It's tricky because there's enough changes that it appears as if I'm functioning as normal, but there's enough changes that I'm not. Yeah, there really is. Yeah. And like you said, like if I get in a jam, I won't know how to get myself out. Yeah. No. Stacy, guidance.
The practical aspect of that would be to put like Life 360 on the phone or find my iPhone or put an Apple AirTag in the car. But Kim's not listening.
Thank you guys. If you have other questions, feel free to pop up. We'll be here.